Executive Director here at Eva Gallery and Art Center. Been here almost 2 years now, so this is becoming a pretty old hat for me. Pretty comfortable. But thank you all for coming. And thank you, Stina, for sharing this beautiful, beautiful work with us. And we're, I'm sure, all very anxious to hear what you have to say. I'm here just to welcome you and to introduce Eva's exhibition manager, Mila, who hangs these wonderful shows and works with the artists so closely. And she is going to introduce Stina. So without further ado, Mila Pinigin.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. So it's my pleasure to introduce Stina Kohnke. She is originally from California and holds her Bachelor of Science from UC Davis and her MFA from Tulane. Her studio is now in Lyme, New Hampshire, and no matter where she is, whether it's California, New Orleans, here in New England, she is always inspired by the landscapes and the places that she is in. It was such a pleasure working with Stina on this show and being able to live with this work because it's constantly changing. You know, you move through the space and each piece is different from each angle, and the light that comes through here plays with the pieces differently at any time of day. So I welcome you to come back when we open at 9 or in the middle of the day, because it really feels like a different atmosphere each time. So Stina, thank you so much for working with us and being so strong in your vision, and it was a real pleasure working on the show with you. So without any further ado, Stina.
Thank you, Tripp, and thank you, Mila. It's a real honor to have my work here at Ava and to be able to work with you and be part of the Ava history. Can you guys hear me? Is this working? Perfect. Recording. It's always kind of this out-of-body experience seeing my work kind of grouped in a public arena like this. And I'm reminded that I've been kind of doing the same thing since I was a child. So I'm going to do a little bit of history of how I kind of got to where I am today with this work. As a child, as Mila mentioned, I grew up in California, and I was around a lot of really natural beauty and kind of grand proportions of old-growth redwoods, cliffs, the Pacific Ocean, kelp. And so I had a natural affinity to that. But I was also really obsessed with manipulating space and collecting items at a very early age. And when I was younger, I did most of this outside. But as I got older, when I was 6 or 7, I started dragging all of my furniture out of my bedroom and turning my bedroom into this intensive daily installation project. So I've always been into moving kind of awkward, heavy things, but I was so obsessed with the space between these objects that I lived in and how they would change in the space. And now I'm very fortunate. I have to put all my furniture back at the end of the day. But it was that kind of obsession, and also I kind of translated things that I felt and perceived as a child into kind of material objects. So as I would choose things, and I would just spend hours arranging them, setting them back, looking at them, moving them around in space. And I did that through my childhood at different scales. And then when I went on to do my undergrad, it was very clear I wanted to work in sculpture. And I was doing a lot of welding and working in wood and plaster. And in when I was a junior, I had a very dramatic back injury, and I had to drop out of school, and I couldn't make these giant pieces that I was accustomed to making. And I had this kind of existential realization that I think partly as a woman in sculpture, I was constantly trying to prove myself on other people's terms. And that, I was really looking, because I couldn't make this work that I had, giant, heavy pieces. I was going back into found objects that I had collected. And because I was lying in bed most of the time, I had pots of wax and wire and pliers. So I was using these very kind of unmasculine, very ephemeral materials. But I really started thinking about my kind of art heroes and things that they prioritized. And it was Picasso, Louise Bourgeois, Lee Montague. And there were artists that weren't trying to make monuments. They were trying to convey some vulnerability, their life, their vision. And it was the courage, instead of fighting vulnerability, it was expressing it. And I just didn't really know how I was going to do that with my environment. And so part of it was I made this leap where I had always collected these found objects, but I started actually incorporating them into my sculpture. And I was thinking about how I could make them my own instead of just having a hodgepodge of found materials. And as I spent these 2 years kind of going back to school doing independent studies, I just started making things that were weird, didn't make sense, but since I wasn't in a regular class, I didn't have to sort of justify the work, I didn't have to prove myself. And I just started this intuitive way of fragmenting and merging and manipulating found objects with forms that I understood. And that was something that just really made sense to me. And I think that's the force behind my work all of these years. So then I moved to New Orleans, and partly because of the found objects, and just it was like this wild kind of island of strange culture. And it really, prior to that, I had spent so much time in the studio. And when I started really using found objects and actually cutting them up and really radically altering them, I ended up spending a great deal more time just looking for material. So, and at this, I've always worked where I collect objects, but I don't know what I'm going to do with them. I never have an idea and I'm going to go get more. It's always the materials that are pushing the ideas. So, I was accumulating and finding, and I was really responding to what I collected. And then I moved around a bit, and everywhere I went, there were certain, just a different kind of vocabulary of objects. And when I moved to New England 20 years ago now, to be with my now husband, I never encountered the New England kind of mill aesthetic. And I had some exposure to the shaker sensibility, but there's a whole nother degree of it when I started traveling around here. And just the severity of the seasons here, everything was so radically different that I really wanted to understand this landscape. And I spent all this time driving around and meeting people, going to flea markets, and so many of these like bobbin mill components really reminded me of natural forms and seaweed or in the body vessels. So I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but I just was really intrigued by them. And as I mentioned earlier, in my childhood, I loved arranging space. And one of my fantasies as a teenager was to create a live workspace. And I was just very taken with the mills and with our beautiful property. And I had a funky studio there that I wanted to tear down and build this live workspace of my dreams. And took many years, many versions of it, many zoning, meeting with people, hiring people to do the construction drawings. But the whole process, and you probably would agree, Jim, you probably did like 50 different designs over the years. It was like this huge puzzle where it was, we were very limited on our footprint. So it was like, what do you give to what space? How do you take advantage of this view? And I wanted to approach it like a sculpture, where I would incorporate found objects into the interior, into the exterior. So I originally tried to work with a friend of Joe's who's an architect, and it was clear that I didn't want a conventional space. I really was going for the sculpture. So I ended up, it took about 13 years of modifying, still kept collecting objects. But it was this interesting parallel where in my work, when I was in New Orleans and I moved up here, I did a lot of casting. I did smaller, after my back injuries, smaller works that kind of were pieced together. And as I was driving around collecting doors, architectural elements, cast iron, pieces like this, my whole studio is like this. I really just learned from picking through this stuff and seeing beautiful elements. And the studio finally happened, and I spent a year and a half really designing the whole interior and incorporating all these things. All the furniture is kind of built into the building, one way or the other. And when I finally had finished that and was actually ready to move into the studio, it was just almost alien. I spent so much time shifting my scale, my speed, the way I worked on a small scale to these giant objects. And the studio itself has 23-foot ceilings. It's a kind of a grand space. I couldn't make small objects. And I had all this leftover material that I had acquired to build the interior. And it really informed this new body of work in the last few years. So I really started working in the new studio kind of early 2016. And there were a lot of things I was trying to resolve. I'd had to merge kind of organic forms with these industrial forms. I discovered rubber hose, which acted like a great kind of bridge between some of my natural forms and some of these industrial found objects. And I went back to this, I mentioned when I was on my back with my back injury that I really wanted to be able to put together pieces in an intuitive way. So I had to come up with a way of this disciplined mindset that when I was in the studio and I was making big moves, that there's no judgment. There is just this kind of fluid exchange, way of piecing things together. And I really couldn't come up with these things unless I had that sort of freedom. And then I had this kind of mental space where I get into smaller moves where I'm really working out transitions and proportions. And they're very separate for me. And that's how often I experiment with materials. I mean, the rubber hose just seemed like it was kind of a stupid material. But once I started working with it, I love how in this piece here it's compressed. And I started kind of in this space coming up with the shadows, the pieces almost make a sound in my head. And this one is very forward. So there were certain, as I was moving things around, it was almost going back to me as a child, there was a dissonance about certain objects and their proximity, and then there's kind of a harmony, or just things would make sense. And almost all of these many, many different iterations. I'm a little restless. It's almost like what Mila was saying, just how it changed. It's like, and sometimes it's hard for me to finish because I always smaller scale, I used more found color, but I really found with these pieces that I had to find a way to unify them. So I used black paint, graphite, and leather, and rubber as a way of kind of merging all of these kind of disparate still so strange to see them up here. So I could talk a lot more about my process, but I'm also kind of curious about maybe I should start with some of your questions and then formulate more of how I work.
I was just wondering, I was thinking there was a musical quality to this as I came in, and I'm just wondering because you just mentioned music once. There was one little part of it. Was there musicians, or is there kind of a music? You said you hear it a little bit. Did you play music when you were growing up, or what?
It's a profound influence, yes. I grew up with a lot of music, and music was a way of kind of expressing moods. And I do see a lot of these works as conveying certain mood. I even at different times have thought of some of these black shells as kind of being reminiscent of a keyboard proportion. And it is, I think whenever I'm moving things around, I'm looking for a certain relationship. And it really is, ties in the sound in my head. So I'm always kind of curious how it'll be in a different way. Yes?
Would you talk specifically, say, about the piece behind you in terms of the numerous decisions that obviously go into it? Why the color, why the relationship between the hammers? Are they hammers? Or
Yep, they're all wooden mallets.
mallets? Why the length of how you decide each of many hundreds of decisions that go into something like that?
It's something I love to do, and it really, I just, like, I know it, I feel it, and obviously when I put things up, I know when it's wrong. And this one, it's so new that I know Jerry Otten mentioned it should pour down to the floor, and I kind of agree. I remember when I first, it took me, at least 10 years, and I didn't know what I was going to do with them until I had, there's 54 here, until I had close to 50. Then all of a sudden I could kind of see where they were going. But I look at it, it's in my head. It makes sense or it doesn't make sense.
So you use the phrase no judgment, but you're certainly using lots of judgment when you're making something and deciding when to stop and when to start, what material to pick up. You didn't juxtapose different materials. Each piece seems to be unified within itself.
Well, I guess when I meant no judgment was the first time that I was going to strain this head to this handle. That, why would you do that? Like, what are you doing here? That sort of like how I first make a connection. And then it goes into that kind of small moves, where I'm doing it. That I'm very obsessive about. And Mila was very patient. I was like, oh, it's all wrong, I had to redo it. Because there's something I'm searching for. And I use both that kind of non-judgmental, intuitive way of reaching it, and also I have a very specific, formal effect that I'm trying to get. So,
Are you satisfied with the work as it looks now?
I am.
Are you going to rework it when you get it?
I have put my back to it in case something is twisted with people moving back and forth. It looks very different than it feels in my studio, just because of the scale and the lighting. It was a little nerve-wracking because I haven't spent enough time. I finished this Friday night. So it's not ideal, but it's also kind of exciting. Like, is it going to flop or is it going to work? Because I knew that I wanted them. There's chains inside of these rubber hose. I knew that I wanted them to hang, but they were just so static before I I added the curves with the rubber hose, and it just seemed like decorative. You know, we have this idea, I lay it out on the floor, and then when it actually comes together, it's just so different. And there are all these things that are really unexpected that are thrown my way. So, I just improvise. It's really so much of what I do. And another thing that was really different that I learned from the construction of the studio is, you know, I've been welding for 30 years, and I realized I don't have to do all my welding. And when I had all this work done with furniture and structural things in the studio, there was something that was very liberating about kind of making a drawing or prototype and having someone else make it. And about 10% of the time, they sort of reinterpret it. And instead of sending it back, I always saw it as an opportunity. And then as I finished the studio, I said, you know, maybe this is another way of kind of giving me new ideas. So I started just giving him, like in this piece here, I brought him an oil can, and I said, you know, make 20 of these, but I don't want it to be hollow, the stem, I want the bottom to be hollow, and I want a threaded nut on the top. And, you know, I've had them in my studio for a couple of years, and we've had so many different lives. I've added bolted them to certain things, to the wall, and I like having that element of something that's mostly, you know, very similar, but I wasn't fussing over. It was kind of, I had the idea, it kind of went away, it came back, and then I could do something with it. And this particular piece, I know I didn't list any of the materials. Those are Amish buggy whips. And, you know, it's so loaded having a whip, you know. It's like, what am I thinking? But I just was so intrigued by the kind of lyrical, you know, it's like this drawing, this line related to the pelt, but kind of related to nerves. Many of them were kind of had broken parts to them that I mend and straighten out, but I wanted them to be kind of bulky. And when I finally decided to put them on the oil can, you know, or like the distributor cap, that I added those balls because my husband and I were talking about, you know, nodes and nerves and how I wanted some connection. I was feeling like it was getting a little industrial, and I wanted to kind of revisit some of the connection to organic forms. So I was really happy with that transition. And then I had to figure out, you know, that's an old bench that I turned upside down, added legs in the opposite direction. So there was a lot of just kind of going with it wherever it was taking me.
So could you just talk about, like you did with this one, what is in each piece? Because I think that's fascinating. You can't really tell now when you see the full thing.
Well, and that I hope is the case because I really want to make it. So this one here, these are from an old woolen mill. The wooden pieces, they were much longer. They were kind of bumper brakes for the wind going back and forth that I cut and added those little bumps. These are from 19th century wheat threshing flails that I've cut up. I just kept the tips. I love, these are laundry sticks that are also 19th century. And it took me forever. These are really, I don't know why, I mean, they're all kind of handmade and they've been in someone's attic for a long, long time. They're very figurative. I mean, obviously I'm inspired by African artwork. And, you know, this, even though it was very utilitarian item, I just loved all the variation. And when I mentioned in that piece how I made those little balls, I use a two-part epoxy kind of putty clay to do a lot of my transitions, and that's what that kind of fussy, like, how am I gonna? I want this to read as one. And I was really thinking that these have these kind of kelp-like feel to them. So the wood is only here, and then this is a piece of spliced wood that I put to connect the wash stick with these flails. Now, do you guys know what I mean by a flail? It's a stick, it's a solid piece of wood, and they would just beat the wheat, break off the. So there's a ton of wear. I really am drawn to, all of these had this where someone held something and kind of polished it with their hand. So, and I really was trying to figure out what to do with them, and when I had this hose around, I really wanted to focus on this negative space in between and how it was elongated. And I went with many different materials trying to figure out how to hang them, since these holes were all different heights. And I discovered lead wire. It's like fantastic. It's a nice complement to the rubber. So I hammered it out and folded that over. These are obviously mallets. These were some of the forms that I just kind of made up, and then it inspired me to have this welder cut out for the bracket. These were a soldering iron handle, so I cut off the whole soldering iron and then I welded on this longer piece here, and it's all threaded, and that's what allowed me to get that tension. And originally, this particular bracket was when I had just 12 of these hammers. I was trying to hang these hammers from this bracket, and it just didn't work. So it's always, you have this plan, you get everything worked out, and it just, I had to totally re-weld all the holes and re-drill everything. And I just happened to have all these handles around because I used the tips for something else. And once again, I didn't have a use for them yet. Should I keep going? I mean, these are more intensive. I'll touch on this one. This one, so this is a found piece here, and then this is a fabricated, it's solid, that slides into the pipe. These are hand forged latches from a door. These are two different wood. Oh, this is spider out there. Wow, and this heat is made the wood crack. I knew I should look at it too closely. And these are stamp handles, rubber stamp. And I just, you know, this is what goes on late at night. I'm just always switching things out. And I love it. And I have all kinds of rubber hose. I love how they have this in this man of the world, jellyfish. This seemed like a mother boat, ominous, kind of don't mess with me form. And it started out with a box, and I built up, and I knew I needed more mass, and I didn't have an object that had the mass I wanted. So I ended up building this with foam and many, many layers of this epoxy putty smoothed out. And it was initially white, and there was this kind of purity to it, and this luminosity of all these kind of layers of this putty, but I just, there was a lot of things going on in the news, and I just needed like this, and putting that graphite on it really made it more ominous, but I really worked with, there's a little bit of the original wood finish, but it was a little too light. This one over there, I did behind the camera with the leather. I kept the natural wood there. It was nice enough. It wasn't too distracting. So, and this was another material that I used in my studio. I was cladding some of the walls with this leather, and this was from some old machine shop, and I, added wood to it, made it wider, tilted it, and to cover that edge of how I altered the back piece, I covered it with leather and cut all these holes out. So, and this originally I had a steel chair sliding in here, and I didn't, and it fit, this all tied in with it, but it didn't need it, and I liked that there was a mystery, that something was there. And this one, These are old shoe racks that I spliced together. And it was something, I just kind of heard them and laid them out on the floor. And I was just trying to find something to the right proportion to tie in with this piece. And actually, this one, many people would hit it in my studio. I just like that it seems so massive though, but it's just hanging.
Stina, what is that at the very top?
It's a cast iron pattern. It's a pattern for cast iron. They would make wooden forms and they would pack a resin sand around them, and then they would pop the pattern on iron. So, like all of these cast iron forms here, they're all made out of wood. And then molds are made from this to make the same thing over and over again. So Louise Nelson used a lot of wooden patterns, and I learned a lot. This is a wooden pattern over here too, the one that's hollow. So probably these have something to do with some steam device. Just different pieces of furniture. This is an architecture detail. This is for a horse to put on their hoof so they wouldn't bang it when they had an injury. And they were just things that I moved around countless times. And I was just always waiting for the right relationship. And I also, when I was making these, I mentioned the keyboard, but there's a Japanese influence. Where I grew up in California, there was a lot of Japanese architecture, Japanese friends. And I just find all that information somehow trickles in, and you just have to trust it when it comes out.
I have a question that's more process-oriented, because some of the work strikes me as very emphasizing the objectness because of the contours, and then other pieces have a very more ambiguous edge, and so it's more about the pattern or the rhythm or something. Do you, in the evolution of the pieces, do you start out with smaller segments? Do you work like finding a rhythm and then making it into a more ambitious piece, or do the pieces that are kind of objects, do they always, from the beginning, do you kind of relate to them as their objectness, as opposed to being a part of an element of something else? Or do they go through a lot of transformation? Like, would you try that as an element in something else and then just leave it by itself eventually?
There's like several answers for that. It really depends on the piece. In fact, that in particular was pretty, it just happened very quickly. Almost all my other pieces just take many trials. And in fact, I have 2 more segments of these shoe racks, and I nearly put another piece with that same wood in it because I wanted to show how I could use it in a very different way. And that it was really more, I covered part of the wood, and it just took on a radically different feel. Because I like how sometimes it's really clear, and other times I really have to work to find that right combination. And this, I mean, all of them really started very, very different. I just start somewhere, and I just know when it doesn't work. I really, it was like trying to figure out my studio in this kind of weird, tight footprint. There's got to be some way to make it work. So it's that process. And so sometimes I have a lot more control over the materials, and sometimes, in this particular piece, the hammer, the mallets really sort of drove me nuts. And I learned so much from them. And I also embraced, I wasn't as fussy about these pieces. All of them I had to drill through them to put a bolt, and I didn't really want to hide the fact that I drilled a huge hole through the mallet. It just seemed sacrilegious, was the first thing. And I couldn't believe how dense the wood was. It was really difficult dealing with. But I just became more and more intrigued with how so many of these mallets had been repaired or had different things done to them. And I didn't want to smooth that out. I was troubled enough by covering them in graphite, but it was necessary. It was just too busy. So did I answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious how you track everything in your studio. I've heard that it's a remarkable place, but I haven't been there yet. And just taking the mallets, I mean, as you were first speaking, my part of the brain that starts counting, so, oh, there's 54 mallets there. And then and part of me thought, well, it would take a long time collecting those from Home Depots around the area. And so obviously you've collected them for a long time.
Well,
And
these
so
are old. These are not new.
They are old. Yeah. And so you have a big box somewhere that you throw the mallets in as you get them, or the buggy whips, and so they're all in like categories, or everything's sort of everywhere, and you kind of, they might have gone together a different way with each other, but instead they all end up together. I'm just curious how that happens.
Well, every time when I'm not actively trying to finish things for a show, I often go out 2 or 3 days a week just looking. And I try to walk around the studio and see what I have. And so I have some drawers, like I have a 12-foot old pharmacy Chester drawers with glass front drawers, so I can see everything. I'm reminded of what I have. And then I know where things are, and then I kind of forget that I had that many mallets. You have a pile of them, but you forget, just the scale and the weight of them all. So I kind of take a visual inventory, and then when I go out, I'm looking for things that could work with what I have. And that is a very significant part of how I begin a project, how I move things forward.
By chance, did you happen to try it when you had 33 of them? Or 47, and somehow 54 was the tipping point?
It was 50 when all of a sudden, I had tried them in many, many other, but it just seemed, it didn't work. There weren't enough, and it just seemed contrived. And actually, what I initially, I know a couple people have been by the studio, I was going to make a quilt out of them, because I saw the mallets as like these round seven forms, and I started drilling holes through them and kind of making them undulate. Robert Rauschenberg's bed on the wall was an inspiration. And it just didn't, they're far too heavy. And it didn't happen. And I just kept, a way that I kind of think about it when I'm also going out junking is I photograph a lot of things, so I can kind of compare and remember. But I get up, I lay things on the floor, I get up on a ladder, and I'm always I move it this way, I stretch it this way. And that's how I'm able to make some of these decisions, because after you move them so many times, you can't really remember. But when I see an image side by side, I go, it definitely has to be farther this way, or longer this way. I need more here. So often I'll go and I'll print out a photograph, and I'll draw on it, or I'll think about it, I'll cut it up. So those are all ways of kind of moving it along. Yes.
Yeah, I wondered about scale. I mean, you're just sort of saying that you try a lot of different things, you put things together, piece things together. Is the new studio influenced?
Oh, huge, yeah.
The scale to which you can...
Just because of the height of the walls and the space, that I was responding. I had I-beams that have a 12-inch I-beams that whatever I put up in there, I had to kind of compete with the space and how big it's on. So I don't foresee myself making small work probably ever.
Did you ever?
Oh, I did when I had back injuries, and it was practical. I had smaller studio spaces, and I was doing a lot of casting. It's just very expensive and heavy. So now that I found cheaper materials and bronze, it just opened up what I could do with my materials in the space.
So you said you started doing this when you were very young. Were you encouraged to make art, or what do you think inspired you, like in your life?
Everything. Two of my siblings are artists, so I grew up with a lot of makers. My parents' friends were artists, visual artists, musicians, poets. So it was just our reality. I didn't grow up with television, so I just had to kind of create. And my brothers were really handy and adventuresome. They did not want to help me with my movie stuff. But no, and my only other sibling is not an artist, is an engineer. So it was just a very, we all have a strong spatial sense. And I went to a lot of museums growing up.
So was it competitive between siblings, or?
We helped each other out, actually. A number of times we'd flown out to help each other with a show. And I use my siblings as a resource. And it's the same. We have different strengths. My younger brother, I think you've seen some of his work, makes a lot of commitment. It's super obsessive, and I could never do what he does, so I really admire his way of working. My sister does more video and installation. Yes, there's so much to cover. I'm definitely a byproduct of
I sort of wonder whether you have sort of echoes of your heroes here. I mean, I see a little Jim Dunn and the handle, tool rack. I mean,
they're everywhere.
And there's a bit of Nancy Grossman, dark period. I just wonder what are some things you think about, some heroes you think about as here? Well, it's everything, I know. Probably unfair, but.
I still think Louise Bourgeois and
Yeah.
Eva Hesse. And in the last few years, I became more aware of Terry Atkins' work. And I feel like, it's very sad that he's gone at such a young age, but there's so much more that I can learn from his work and how he worked and his materials. And, I learned a tremendous amount from Louise Nelson, just formally, but I felt I needed, I want my work to be a little more emotional and vulnerable, and really get that feeling from her work. So, yes, I'm always kind of realizing that African influence is huge, and every time, and even the Egyptian, I never submitted to much when I was young. And the idea of like these functional, mundane objects becoming art is very much an African philosophy. So I know there's more. Yes, Catherine.
Earlier work that I know of was quite surreal in nature. It was very evocative and narrated in sort of different ways. And I was wondering about this trajectory to what I see as more abstract language, still holding that sort of found object type of essence in it. That's one of the things you get in surrealism. But you want to comment at all on that?
The building of the studio really just changed me. That I moved away from some of that kind of almost perverse sexual, some of the things that I associate with surrealism, and that the abstraction, it related more to architecture for me. Surrealism seemed more about the body and more intimate and more mental, and I was going more into this full body response, and the industrial, quality of these objects really kind of dictated that. They weren't really polished enough. I think with surrealism, I was fussier when I was doing more of that work, and I got kind of more free and a little raw. So that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Stina, you mentioned music and the influence of music on your work. Do you listen to music when you work in your studio?
I do, but it's such other times I work in total silence. When I'm doing the fussy stuff, it's like, I need that. It's just like, if I razor blade this one more time. And especially when there's so many of them, I start counting them. That's when I really need to have some like aggressive music to keep it going. But when I'm doing more of my fluid work, it's either in silence or in quieter music that really sort of helps shape my mood. But I grew up with my father with a ton of classical music, so there's so much of that mood that when I'm working and I'm thinking, even though I'm not listening to that kind of music, it's just burned into my memory. It connects with how I work.
I just wanted to ask one other question. Do you play with the lighting, the exhibition lighting in your studio, or did some of the magic of the shadows happen in the installation?
You know, I have great diffuse light, so the shadows really come only at night when I put my lights on them. But there's so many other things I'm thinking about. I think shadows come really at the end. I'm really focused on this space and then tweaking it so that the shadows, it's always later. Well, I really appreciate you coming out and all your great questions. It was really it's an honor to share this with you.
Thank you.